come to the last part of our green technologies, and arguably one of the areas we can make individually the biggest difference. It's about green buildings. And it's not just about buildings. Don't think of a big building. Think of what we call the built environment. Now, a lot of our emissions, and the percentages vary, but it could be up to 40%, come from buildings. Why? Because cement pollutes, the electricity we use pollutes, the way we live and consume pollutes. And when we think about CO2 and other harmful gases, a lot of them come from our buildings. So tackling the built environment and making it more sustainable not only makes the buildings themselves green, which we will talk about, but it makes living in them green. So life becomes more sustainable when you live in that building. The building allows you to consume less, travel less, and even consume and recycle more. So what is a green building? Well, let's start from the construction of the building. When we think about a building, we think a place where people live. It's a built environment. First of all, we have to design them in a better way, in a more sustainable way, a way that reduces the need for travel, reduces the need for sending things around. So there's something about the design, and this can be applied to a wider city when we come to talk about smart cities in terms of urban planning and transportation. But let's stay in the building. The design of the building can be more sustainable in terms of allowing the certain movement and flow of people and information. The material we use in the building, we're talking about these days about green cement, about cement that breathes. We're talking about using material that are recyclable. We're talking about using raw material like green flooring with bamboo. So there's a lot of the material that go into the building, let alone the connections, the wires, the amount of wiring we have in a building. Then think through the energy of the building. So how do you put the building on in terms of electricity? How do you heat it? How do you reduce the heat? Using ACs, using renewable energy, using solar energy. And you can see now that the building itself can become green. The water we use in the building, if you recall our example of air to water, some buildings are using air to water to produce part at least of their needs. Then, living in the building, how do we dispose of our waste? Does the building allow us to separate, segregate, and recycle? So the design of the building from A to Z could consume less water, less electricity, help people live more sustainably, have cleaner air, use nanotechnology in the air filters, use air to water to produce cleaner water or some of its consumption needs. It's designed for less movement, less transportation. It allows people to live healthier and more in a more productive way. Even in some buildings now, we're installing certain panels where people walk up and down the stairs. Those steps are being translated into energy. Those buildings are what we call green buildings. Now, how do we know if our building is green? There are many, many certifications out there. One of the more famous ones is the LEED certification. And the LEED certification is simple. It has a list of criteria that if you use properly and if you apply it in your building, then you deserve a stamp called you have a building that's LEED, that is sustainable. And this applies to everything I mentioned, from the design to the life in the building, to the air we consume, the water we consume, the energy we consume. And you could be multiple levels of LEED. So you could reach gold level, you could reach a gold standard. And the reason these exist are two. One is that these buildings, when they are LEED buildings, they're sending a very strong signal for people that living in this building is healthier for themselves in the present moment and healthier for the future generations. So these are intergenerational buildings. Also, they're sending a very strong message to the buyers who are now becoming much more aware of the need to buy products, services, and buildings and houses and places to live in a place that is more sustainable. But also, these green buildings are more efficient. So in the long run, they use less electricity, so you pay less. They use less water. They help us with recycling. So they are actually cost reduction in these buildings. And there's many examples of these green buildings that are coming up around the world. There are many examples in our region. Let me start by an example from outside the Middle East and Africa that I think about areas where these green buildings have been affecting our lives. I'll use an example of a green building from Singapore, which is a library. And the reason we use that example is to remind us that buildings are not just things we live in. We talk about the built environment, our offices, our libraries, our public spaces, our factories. Everything that we build requires energy and requires water and requires electricity and needs to help us live in a much better way. So if we start from libraries, how do we light these libraries up? Do they have lights on demand? Do we use solar panels? How do we filter the air? Do we use air conditioning, or do we build design in a certain way that the building has airflow that allows it to cool itself to a certain degree? This is not going to turn the building into completely net zero buildings. That is a way far away yet in our near future. But we have buildings that are aiming to be net zero. And now we have buildings being built in our part of the world that are able to produce at least 40% of their electricity and water needs within the building in a renewable manner. So we're seeing buildings becoming net zero buildings. We have buildings today that are corporate headquarters, places like we see in the United Arab Emirates, like Pacific Controls, who the whole headquarter has been built in a sustainable manner in terms of the energy it consumes, in terms of its pressure on the system, in terms of the movement within the building. We have other examples from other places like Bahrain, and we see the actual financial center. These buildings were built from day one. Now, there's two ways to make your buildings green. One is like the examples I mentioned, which are designed to be green, and this is built by design. And this is a very early, very conscious decision to say we will make the building green and we will achieve LEED certification. Now, the majority of our world has not been built in the last 10 years. It's been built many, many years ago. And hence, that part requires retrofitting. And there's a whole new movement and a whole new market now about retrofitting old buildings. It takes time, it takes cost. Some of them have to be demolished and replaced, but a lot of them can be retrofit. Installing more efficient air conditioning systems or heating systems, installing more nature-based flooring and green flooring, installing a little bit of a photovoltaic cells to produce energy. So retrofitting is the way forward for many, many of our buildings, and especially in public spaces, especially when we talk about governments, stadiums, libraries, and so on. Now, if we think through, there's a lot of breakthroughs coming in green buildings. I mentioned very quickly, and I don't know if you've noticed, breathable cement. Nanotechnology with biology now are merging with cement production and actually producing a new form of organic material that can breathe, that can actually suck CO2 from the air. Imagine if our buildings themselves start becoming filters for a cleaner air. We are now looking at nature-based solutions in our designs, where the flow of air can go through like the old style buildings in the Arabian Gulf, Al-Barajil, where you can have the airflow coming through and cooling the system without actually having to use freon gas and ACs. So these are nature-based design because nature can teach us a lot about design and making our life more sustainable. There's technological breakthroughs, as I mentioned, in terms of being able to putting cells and Internet of Things and being able to collect pressure from weight, steps on the people stepping on steps and turning that into energy. There are some innovations now where bike paths, we'll see in Holland, in cities, where the whole bike path is lit by solar energy, but we're using the energy from the bikes on the path as well to create more energy. There's many breakthroughs that are coming to the built environment, and these breakthroughs are actually being demanded by clients, by people who are using these things, but they are actually making these products actually more sustainable and more efficient and cheaper to use. So if we think through this, how do we translate this into our homes? Well, there's a lot of uses into homes. First of all, the homes themselves can be green buildings. But also the things that happen in the home, as I mentioned, are becoming more in terms of innovations of policies. We're seeing now homes produce energy and share it with other homes. We're seeing homes now as a center for recycling, where the distribution for these recycling materials starts in terms of different types of bins and different types of collections. We're seeing the homes as a place where we teach fresh consumption. So the home is much more than a built environment. It's a social construct that has the building, it has the consumption, it has the connectivity to the solar and the wind, and this is causing also more independent. We're seeing independent homes that after the pandemic, there has been a lot of design competitions to see how can we produce independent homes. independent communities. If you recall, in the pandemic, there was a lot of lockdowns in the COVID-19 pandemic, and the lockdowns caused people to feel a bit isolated. Food supply chains were difficult, energy supply chains were difficult, and the question now is more sustainable homes can also be self-sufficient and maybe in some of the energy production, maybe in some of the water production, maybe in terms of some of the food production as well, because of hydroponic agriculture, because of being able to use the roofs better. So now we're thinking of homes as sustainable units that can produce a lot of the resources they need and in a recyclable and in a very sustainable and renewable manner. So this is a good time now to think through as groups about this activity. And this activity is about sustainable built environment, but this starts to translate into how we live our life, because you have to consider the built environment as a socio-economic construct. It has a physical building and it has people living in it and consuming. And the building design itself forces you to do certain things, forces you to walk in certain areas and in certain ways. So think through how these designs can impact our life and how moving forward architecture and nature-based designs can be the solution to change how we design our built environment to make it much more sustainable.